We have been studying about the life of David. Tonight we'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 22. We are coming to the end of David's life. He is an old man. But this particular chapter is very similar and in some places identical to Psalm chapter 18. Psalm chapter 18 is a hymn of praise for God's deliverance of David throughout his life from his enemies. This is very similar. This is most that are students, scholars of the Old Testament seem to believe that this actually was written, although it's posted here at the end of his life. Probably David wrote this sometime after he was delivered from Saul, after the 10 years of running from him. Very briefly, as I always say, we're studying about David because he was a man after God's own heart. He was not a perfect man, and yet he was a man after God's own heart. He was not a man without sin, and yet after he died, he was still described in Acts chapter 13 as a man after God's own heart. And so, while Jesus is our example, and he is the one that we are to imitate, we can know that God realizes that we're not going to live a perfect life. That's why Jesus said, be faithful even unto death. And that's what we'll see, that's what we've seen in the life of David. David has not been perfect. We've seen where he has fallen many times into sin, and yet the difference between him and others in the Bible that are identified as committing sin is he had a penitent heart. And he never gave up on trying to live in a way that was pleasing to God. There were times that he was weak and where his flesh was concerned, but he did not give in and live in that sin. He would come back to be what God would have be with that penitent heart. Like I said, David's life is coming to an end, and we're going to see in the next chapter where he's going to name, after chapter 23, some of those mighty men who have fought for him, and rename them so that they can be identified again. And then we're coming to the very end. He actually dies in 1 Kings chapter 2. All right, let's begin with verse 1. Then David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day when the Lord had delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So you notice here, it begins by saying David wrote this song, and it has something to do with the fact that he was delivered from Saul. And so this is a good indicator that this was written earlier in his life. I'm sorry. Verse 2, and he said, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, the God of my strength in whom I will trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior, you saved me from violence. So David, in these the second and third verses here, he uses metaphors here, terms to describe God in a physical sense, but they were terms that he's using that made sense to him, that was understandable in his mind as far as what he was trying to say about God and what people would understand he was trying to say. Because when it comes to describing God, we really have the words that are going to be accurate, completely accurate. So David's doing the best he can based upon his life and how he felt about God's relationship and what he'd done for him. God has been David's rock. That means God has been that solid, immovable force in his life. God has been David's fortress. That means that God has been David's place of refuge. God has been David's shield. That means he's been his protector in his life, in battle. And God has been David's horn. A horn was something that, as a man of war, a horn communicated, gave instructions as to whether we're going to advance or retreat or stop. The horn gave instructions. God has been David, as he said, his horn. He's the one that he listened to know what command he was to follow. Verse 4, I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? We sing this particular song, these words, and the same words that we find in Psalm chapter 18. To call upon the Lord. What David's saying is he places complete confidence in God, and he would put himself in his care. He recognizes when it comes to praise, only God is worthy and should be praised. And only God can save him from his enemies. So, you ever get tired of coughing? Romans chapter 10, verse 13, Paul said, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Well, David has said, I'll call upon the name of the Lord, who's worthy to be praised, and so shall I be, what? Saved from my enemies. We're told, whoever calls the name of the Lord shall be saved. Romans 10:13. Verse 5. When the waves of death surrounded me, that means when the pangs of death were in his life, he said, the floods of ungodliness made me afraid. Flood, that term flood, means that the pangs of death, they just kept coming. They were just flooding in. You know, if you think about a flood is something you can't stop. You know, the force of the flood, you can't divert it. It's just going to keep coming. And so David said these waves of death, they surrounded him. The floods of ungodliness made him afraid. The ungodliness, he's talking about ungodly men. He's talking about men within his own camp. See, it's one thing to deal with ungodliness outside the camp. You expect that. But what caused him to feel so much pain was when he had to deal with the ungodliness from within his own nation, his own people. People that should have, they should have thought better. And he says, their ungodliness, it just flooded in. It made me afraid, meaning it was overwhelming. David said that he was overwhelmed, just the pangs that caused from his brethren. Who he should have been able to have confidence in, overwhelmed him. Now that's when a lot of times people will feel like, well, it's just time to give up. Well, sometimes that's true in the church. Paul, when talking to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 2 through 5, Paul told Timothy, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season, convince, rebuke, exhort with all longsuffering and teaching, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but will heap up to themselves teachers according to their own desires. The time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, will heap up for themselves teachers. And they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. Now, who's Paul talking to Timothy about? He's not talking about the world. When he says preach the word, he's not telling them to preach the word, although we preach the word to the world. In this instance, in what he's talking about, he's saying preach the word to your brethren. Because there's going to come a day when your brethren will not listen to sound doctrine. They're going to have their own idea of what they like and what they don't like. They're going to need somebody to scratch their ear. That's the preacher I want. I like what he says. Look at verse 5 here of 2 Timothy 4. But you be watchful in all things, endure afflictions. You know what David said? He said, the pangs, the waves of death surround me, the pangs of death, that, the pain that's caused by who? Ungodly brethren. It was overwhelming. And Paul told Timothy, endure afflictions. He's not talking about the afflictions of the world. He's talking about afflictions that he would have within the church when he was preaching what was right, wanting the brethren to do what's right. That's why Paul had to say at one point, have I become your enemy? Who's he talking to? Brethren, have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Timothy, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. So what Paul told Timothy was, everybody's not going to like you all the time. Everybody's not going to approve of what you preach all the time. There's going to be some brethren that don't want to hear sound doctrine. And they're going to be tough on you. Endure the afflictions. Do the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. Verse 6, back in 2 Samuel 22 here. The sorrows of Sheol surrounded me. Now the word Sheol here means the abode of the dead. The snares of death confronted me, and in my distress I called upon the Lord and cried out to my God. So in my distress, David said, I gave up. That's what he said he felt like doing. But that's not what he says here. I was so hurt and overwhelmed by the afflictions of my brethren. I wanted to give up. There was sorrow of the dead all around me. Snares of death all around me. So what'd you do? Did you give up, David? No, in my distress, I called upon the Lord and cried out to my God. Now, why would he do that? Because God's the only one that's going to be able to help him. Sadly, sometimes there are those that when they face the afflictions, they quit. Preachers quit. Brethren quit. Because it's not supposed to be this way. No, it's not supposed to be that way. That's why Paul said, endure the afflictions. Do the work of an evangelist. Do the work of a Christian. Trust in the Lord. That's what David did. He cried out to the Lord. And we read verse 7 continuing, he heard my voice from his temple, and my cry entered his ears. You see, God hears, he cares, and he helps. And David believed that, trusted that. Verse 8, then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of heaven quaked and were shaken because he was angry. Now, why is God angry? Because David has enemies. And David's enemies were God's enemies. Because David was wanting to do what was right, and there were people around him who were doing wrong. And so David describes God's anger towards his enemies, beginning here in verse 9. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Coals were kindled by it. So what's to be understood by this? We know that David didn't see God, smoke coming out of his nose. He didn't literally, physically see God. Well, this describes an anger of intenseness, hot, God is very angry. Verse 10, he bowed the heavens also and came down with darkness under his feet. So here we got the darkness of God's anger being described. In verse 11, and he rode upon a cherub and flew, and he was seen upon the wings of the wind. Now, did David see God on the back of a cherub? No. Again, he's using these metaphors to try to give us a picture of what he, and try to describe his relationship with God. And the fact that it's talked about, when he's talked about God riding on the back of the cherub, on the wings of the cherub, all that means is that the figurative language is that there's no place where God's enemies or anyone could go to escape, but his enemies could not escape his vengeance. Verse 12, he made darkness canopies around him, dark waters and thick clouds of the sky. Darkness here is described in such a magnitude that David says it actually became part of his cloak. Verse 13, from the brightness before him, coals of fire were kindled. So brightness before him would indicate that nobody could hide anywhere. You could go climb in a cave. You could hide where you think it's dark, but the brightness of God will illuminate you, and so God's going to be able to see you. You cannot hide from him. Verse 14, the Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice. I'm not sure that we can appreciate that particular thought that the Lord thundered from heaven. I mean, David again is using metaphor to describe, and so if we try, I'm sorry. I'm allergic to somebody in this building. The Lord thundered from heaven. We've had a little bit of thunder here lately. Have you ever had thunder you had that clap of thunder that just shook the house? Made you sit straight up in bed or jump out of your chair, it was just boom, just overwhelming. Well, this is the image that David's trying to describe here, is when God speaks, there's no ignoring it. Everybody's going to hear it. It's an overwhelming feeling. And the Most High uttered his voice. He sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning bolts, and he vanquished them. No foe, what David's saying is, could withstand the wrath of God and his defense of his righteous children. And this is God not being angry just because people are opposing him. This is his anger against enemies of his children. David is saying this is how God dealt with his enemies. Verse 16. Then the channels of the sea were seen, the foundations of the world were uncovered at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. So God, what David's saying is he had saved them. There have been many different dangers and perils. I talked about the many different waters, all the different struggles and dangers that he went through. Verse 18, he delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hate me, for they were too strong for me. So David's enemies, David says his enemies were not just strong, they were too strong for him. David said, I couldn't handle it. There's nothing I could do to be able to resist my enemies, the power. That's why I needed God. Only God's help would help him to prevail. Verse 19. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. So David's enemies, they came after him in the day of his calamity when they thought he was most vulnerable, when he was weakest. Now's the time to go after David, they thought. And it was the time to go after him, except for the fact that God was still with him. God was on his side and would help him. Verse 20, he also brought me out into a broad place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. So God made his presence known through his support for David. Now, as we look at this, let me remind you, David says he wrote this where his enemies were concerned, and he specifically named Saul. Well, who was Saul? Well, he was king. Who was Saul? Saul is part of his family, nation, brethren. And so as he's talking about this and what God did for him, this is in regard to what God did to Saul and all others that opposed David, who were not wanting to do what was right. Verse 21, the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands. He has recompensed me, for I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. Now, notice what David says. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands. Verse 22, I have kept the ways of the Lord. Didn't David sin? Didn't David? Was he perfect? No, we know that. And yet he says God rewarded him according to his righteousness. Notice here the second line, verse 22. This would be, I have not wickedly departed from my God. There's a difference between sinning and staying in sin, and sinning and being penitent. David did not depart from God. He did not wickedly, as he put it, depart from God. He didn't go into sin and just say, I'm going to live in rebellion to God. David was not perfect, but David was what? Faithful. Let's keep reading here. Verse 23. Or the rest of verse 22. The cleanliness of his hand. No. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, he said. Well, let's look at verse 23. For all his judgments were before me. And as for his statutes, I did not depart from them. I was also blameless before him. I kept myself from iniquity. Therefore the Lord has recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his eyes. Now David's not saying I've never sinned. David's also not saying that I've earned my salvation. But as I've already stated, what he is saying is, I never departed with my determination. God never departed from my determination to serve God. Oh, I messed up. But it never left my core that my life was to serve God. He's not saying I've been perfect, but he is saying, as I stated, I've been faithful. And as we look at Revelation 2:10, where Jesus said, be faithful even unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. There's a difference between being faithful and perfect, as I've said many times. Perfect means without flaw. Faithful means that you wished you'd lived without flaw, but since you didn't, you're sorry. You didn't make exceptions. You didn't make excuses like Saul did. See, that was Saul's problem. Saul would say, I have sinned. But the people. David, when he would say, I've sinned, he would say, I deserve what I get. And And I ask God for his mercy. Verse 26, with the merciful, you will show yourself merciful. With the blameless man, you will show yourself blameless. With the pure, you will show yourself pure. With the devious, you shall show yourself shrewd. You will save the humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty, that you may bring them down. So what David's saying here is, he's not saying that God became haughty because he was dealing with a haughty person, or he was like they were in their eyes. That's how God became to them, because of the fact that when you oppose God, God opposes you, and the person that hates what's right is going to hate God, and they're going to look at God as being the enemy, the one as being wrong. If we show ourselves to be faithful and loyal to God, then God will be seen by man to be faithful and loyal to me. But if I show myself to be out of harmony with God's will, then God will be seen by men to be opposed to me. If I'm not living the way God would have me live, then the world is going to look at me and say that God opposes me. But if I'm trying to be faithful, then they see the opposite of that. Verse 29, for you are my lamp, O Lord, the Lord shall enlighten my darkness. So David's saying during the darkest times of his life, God was his light. He was in his life. For by you I can run against a troop. By my God I can leap over a wall. Now again, he's talking about physical things to make his point that the things that seem impossible for man to do are impossible to do unless they have God in their life. David talks about the fact that he could run against a whole troop in war, or he could run and leap over a wall. These are obstacles that most would say you can't overcome that. That reminds me of the story about Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 14, where Jonathan and his armor bearer slipped out of the camp. They're fighting against the Philistines, but most of Saul's army is hiding. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, let's go fight. And they came to a place where there was Philistines up on a high cliff. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, here's what we're going to do. We're going to say, we want to fight. And if they say, well, hold on, we'll come down there. We'll stay here and we'll fight them. But if they say, well, come on up here, we'll know that God has delivered them into our hands. Verse 6 says, Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by a few. And if you read the rest of that story, Jonathan and his armor bearer climbed up there and began to kill all the Philistines that came out to fight, because God was on their side. Verse 31, as for God, his way is perfect. The way of the Lord is proven. He is a shield to all who trust him. So God's way has been tried and it's been proved. And God can deliver us from any bondage of sin, David is saying. For who is God except the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? So David asked the question, who's God? The answer is he's the Lord. Verse 33, God is my strength and power, and he makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of deer and sets me on my high places. He teaches my hands to make war, so that his arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have also given me the shield of your salvation. Your gentleness has made me great. You enlarged my path under me, so my feet did not slip. So David goes through this list of accomplishments, and he gives God credit. But then notice what he says, I pursued my enemies and destroyed them. Neither did I turn back again till they were destroyed, and I have destroyed them and wounded them so that they could not rise. They have fallen under my feet. So David just saying, you get all the credit, God, and then he says, but I have. Well, is he taking credit? Then he tells us how he's done it. Verse 40, for you have armed me with strength for the battle. I've been able to do all these things, God, because you helped me. I did this, but how? Because you helped, because you were involved. You have armed me with strength for the battle. You have subdued under me those who rose against me. You have also given me the necks of my enemies so that I destroyed those who hated me. I've been able to do this, David says, because of you. Verse 42, they looked, but there was none to save, even to the Lord, but he did not answer them. Then I beat them as fine as the dust of the earth. I trod them like dirt in the streets, and I spread them out. So even David's enemies, in talking about Saul, they looked for divine assistance. Remember how Saul, he wanted God's help. God had already left him, but he still sought God's help, but there was none. Verse 44, you have also delivered me from the strivings of my people. You have kept me as the head of the nations. So God has helped David during times of rebellion and insurrection. There were those that would want him dead, that would want to oust him, that would want to replace him. But you've kept me as the head of the nations. A people I have known shall serve me. The foreigners submit to me. As soon as they hear, they obey me. The foreigners fade away and come frightened from their hideouts. So David was a ruler of the Jews. He was not the ruler of the heathen nations round about him, and yet his reputation gave him the power over them, his reputation alone, and David gives God credit for that. Verse 47, the Lord lives, blessed be my rock. Let God be exalted, the rock of my salvation. It is God who avenges me and subdues the peoples under me. He delivers me from my enemies. You also lift me up above those who rise against me. You have delivered me from the violent men. So David exalts God as the rock of his salvation, his avenger, and the one that has protected him from his enemies, that lifted him up above his enemies. And then verse 50, therefore. Now, as I'm sure you've heard many times, anytime you see the word therefore, you need to stop and think about what it's there for. This is a word of conclusion. Because of everything that he just previously said, we can come to this conclusion. What I'm about to say, basically David is saying, only makes sense because of what I just finished saying. And that is, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the Gentiles, and sing praises to your name. He is the tower of salvation to his king, and shows mercy to his anointed, to David and his descendants forevermore. So I will give thanks to the Lord, even among non-believers. And that's something that we need to always keep in mind, is the name of the Lord needs to go forth to the non-believers. And David said, they may not believe, but they're going to know in my life that I believe, and that there is only one and only true God. All right, that comes to the end of that chapter. Anybody got a question or comment? Well, I apologize for my voice tonight. I don't know what to do about it other than keep blowing my nose and coughing. All right, well, I'm not going to go any further. There's no comment or question. The other classes still have about 4 minutes. We'll give them their time, but we'll be dismissed. Thank you for your attention.